So a little bit about me. I'm from San Diego, born and raised. I could call myself a cradle Catholic because I was baptized at Mary Star of the Sea in La Jolla in 1956. So a long time ago. But I prefer to call myself a creedal Catholic because I fall back on the creed. That's the foundation for me in my life. The creed to me is what it's all about. No matter what problems our church gets itself into, I always fall back on the creed because that is the foundational teachings of our church. So the creed to me is foundational. And I was raised mainly in Spring Valley. I went to St. John of the Cross school. My parents could only afford to put me first, second, and third grade in Catholic school. And so after that, it was all public school from fourth grade on. My parents were wonderful parents. I'm in ministry because of Bishop Fulton Sheen, who I mentioned last night, who I revered, and I love his readings and his talks, but also because I had such wonderful parents. Not that they were the smartest parents or the most loving, but they were both, but because they were practical, and they taught me a practical faith. That my mother, when we went through, for those of you old enough to remember when Vatican II hit in the mid-60s and the churches started changing, we went from the Latin Mass and we went to holding hands and folk music. My mother couldn't take that. And so she stopped going to Mass, at regular Masses on Sunday. She'd go to the very early one, or she would go daily Mass, where they didn't do that holding hands stuff at the Our Father, and they didn't sing those folk songs with the guitars. And so she found a way to remain in her faith and remain a good Catholic, even though she was not embracing the changes in the church. And I remember she said to me one time, she said, "Mark, this is important. I know you love God and I know you love your faith. Just because I can't embrace the changes, it should not impact you. You follow your heart, you follow where the Lord leads you." So that's what she told me. So unlike some parents who said, "You're going to do it my way," because I have a certain mindset regarding the church, I expect you to have the same mindset. My mother said, "I planted a seed in you. You let that seed come to fruition." Amen? That's what she did. She was a great. I'm going to tell one more story about my parents. When I was 11 years old, a friend of mine from school died. I think we were both at, I don't know, what school was I going to? At Bancroft Elementary over in Spring Valley. And 11-year-old friend of mine died. And his mother came to me and she said, "You were his best friend. Would you say something at his funeral?" And I said, "Well, I'd be happy to. Let me ask my parents." I went and I talked to my parents. And that, by the way, shows you I'm old, right? The fact that I would say, "I'm going to go ask my parents." That's something they don't seem to do as much today. But I went and I talked to my mom and dad, and I said, "As you know, so-and-so died, and his mom asked me to speak at the funeral. Is that okay?" And my mother said, "No, you can't." And I was shocked, and I said, "Why not?" My mother said, "Because he's Methodist. And the funeral will be at the Methodist church." Now, you younger folks aren't going to remember this, but those of you with a couple years on you, you remember when we were told you couldn't go in any other kind of church. You couldn't go into a Methodist church. You couldn't, in fact, you couldn't walk on the sidewalk in front of it because, God forbid, you get sucked in somehow. So that's the way we were raised. You couldn't do it. And so I argued with my mother and I said, "Wait a minute, you told me, you raised me to believe there's one God, only one God. Why can't I do this?" And she said, "Let's go and talk to the pastor." The pastor at the time at St. John of the Cross was a little old Irish guy named Monsignor McDonough. And you remember him? Yeah, did you? Help me with my memory. Was he as scary looking, really, as I remember? I mean, because all of us kids were scared to death of this guy. I was sure that when he looked at the mirror, he scared himself. And so my mother and father took me to go and sit with Monsignor McDonough, and we said, he said, "What's the issue?" And I said, "Well, my friend died. They want me to go and say something at his funeral, Methodist church." And Monsignor McDonough said, "Well, you can't do it. You can't go." And I started to argue with him and said, "Wait a minute, my mom raised me, there's one God. My mother kicked me under the table." Shh, quiet, Mark. Well, when we left, we're leaving the church. I'm sitting in the back seat and I'm pouting. Our red Nomad station wagon, if you remember those old Chevy Nomad station wagon, bright red. And my mother turns around and she said, "We're taking you to the funeral." What she taught me, she and my father, was that there's times when it's okay to break the rules. And those times are when it's to be with or to help people. And you're always to put people ahead of rules. And I believe that's the message of Jesus. He railed against the people who made rules more important than people. Remember? God gave Moses how many commandments? 10. By the time Jesus came along, the Jewish people took those 10 commandments and turned it into 613. And Jesus said, "You're focused too much on the rules. All you need are 2. Love God, love each other. Everything will fall into place. All the other rules will fall into place." Have you heard that? So our Jesus, the Jesus that is the founder of our church, amen, gave us 2 commandments. Love God and love each other. Our church has taken those 2, and we now have 2,000 rules called canon law. What does that tell us? It tells us when man gets involved, they start distorting what God had in mind. Rules are important, rules are good. But my parents taught me, if it comes to a rule or being there for people, default to people. And that was one of the best lessons that I ever learned. And because of that, by the way, I've always been in my heart and my spirit ecumenical. I've never turned down any group that's ever asked me to speak. I've been in synagogues, I've been in mosques, I've been everywhere. I've been in every kind of Protestant church you can think of, and evangelical, and every kind you can think of. If they invited me, I went there. And I always had a rule. If I get invited to speak, I'm going to read what their books are. Like I was invited to speak with the Mormons. I read the Book of Mormon twice, and I read their Doctrines and Covenants. When I was invited the first time to go speak for Muslims, I read the Quran. I read it 2 times all the way through because I want to show respect for other people when I'm in their faith. And so that's just what I was raised to do. So I'm a respecter of people and their faith, even though I'm a very proud Catholic. For 5 years, I taught preaching for Robert Schuller up at the Crystal Cathedral. And he used to joke with me, and he called me his token Catholic, because they always knew I was Catholic, because I never hid it. I'm a proud Catholic. I am very happy to be Catholic. I'm proud of my church. Even during the tough times, I still remained strong in ministry and supported the church and told every group I ever spoke to that I was Catholic. I never hid it. So Schuller called me his token Catholic. Well, when they lost the Crystal Cathedral through bankruptcy, and it came down to Chapman College or the Catholic Church, the Diocese of Orange, getting the church, Schuller himself called the bankruptcy judge and said, "I'd like it to remain a church." And that's why the Diocese of Orange got the Crystal Cathedral, which is now the Christ Cathedral. And when I learned that, I called him up and I said, "Well, I guess you're now the token Protestant." So all my life, I have tried to be a person, no matter what business or work I was doing, I never stopped ministry. I never gave up on ministry. I entertained the seminary, discerned the seminary at one point years ago, and decided for a variety of reasons it wasn't for me, but I never stopped ministry. I had a bishop friend in Michigan, Bishop Cooney. He said, "Mark," he says, "you're preaching in all of our churches." He says, "Why don't you let me make you a deacon?" And I said, "Well, thank you, Bishop, but no thank you." I said there needs to be more people in our church who are not ordained, who are still out there strong in ministry and making ministry a priority. People need to see other non-ordained. Ordained's wonderful and beautiful, but you expect them to do ministry. It's when you see people who are not ordained doing it. That's when maybe we open our eyes a little bit more. Am I right? And by the way, somebody who you know of was never ordained, and yet most people think he was. Francis of Assisi was never ordained, was never a deacon, was never a priest, never ordained. But look at all the good he did. So we can do good. God has called us not because we're ordained or not ordained. He called us because we're his children and he loves us. And it's our responsibility to accept that. And wherever we are, whether we're ordained or not ordained, serve the Lord with whatever gifts or talents we have. Amen?